Welcome back to Through a Glass Darkly Radio on United Public Radio. And the intro music was Mark of the Doomslayer by Carl Casey at White Bat Audio. Our guest tonight is Joshua Cutchin. He's appeared on a wide variety of paranormal programs discussing his work, including Coast to Coast AM and the hit History Channel television show Ancient Aliens. He is the author of 7 critically acclaimed books: 2015's A Trojan Feast, The Food and Drink Offerings of Aliens, Fairies, and Sasquatch, translated into Spanish as Paquete Troyano. I probably butchered that. 2016's The Brimstone Defeat, an in-depth examination of supernatural scents, otherworldly odors, and monstrous miasmas. 2018's Thieves in the Night, a brief history of supernatural child abductions, and 2020's Where the Footprints End, High Strangeness and the Bigfoot Phenomenon. Volumes 1 and 2 with Timothy Renner. In 2022, he released his 2-part masterwork, Ecology of Souls, a new mythology of death and the paranormal. 2023 marked the release of his first fictional novel, Them Old Ways Never Died, as well as his curated collection of essays, Fairy Films, We Folk on the Big Screen. Joshua has been invited to speak at Georgia MUFON events, the International Fortean Organization's Fort Fests, Maryland 2016 and 2019, X-Files United Conference, Rhode Island 2019, Con Carolinas, North Carolina 2019 through 2021, Strange Realities Conference, Tennessee 2019 through 2023, East-West Bookshop, Tewksbury Public Libraries, Fright Nights 2020, Morbid Anatomy 2022, Phenomenomicon 2020, hosted by Greg and Dana Newkirk, the Worldwide Metaphysical Tribe, Illinois 2022, the Midwest Conference on the Unknown, Missouri 2022, DragonCon, Georgia 2022 to 2023, Archives of the Impossible, Texas 2023, and an inquiry into anomalous experiences and the phenomenon, New York City 2023. Woo! That was a lot. It was a lot to talk about. So without any further ado, Josh, welcome back.
It's good to be here. I need to pare that bio down some, it sounds like.
Yeah, I kind of realized about 3/4 of the way, and I'm like, I probably don't need to talk about all these conferences, but you know what? Since I'm already going, I might as well just keep going, right?
There was
Churchill
something
say, when you're going through hell, just keep going. Keep going.
There was something with that I sent in a bio for, and I did the long bio, the full bio, and then I did a shorter one, and then I just shortened it to Joshua Likes Monsters. And I was like, maybe you just want to use that one instead. It's easier.
Yeah, that's right. And thank you, Steve Johnson. Yes, we need stars. Thank you. Okay. Oh, Kent. Kent is back. Kent, you're on the radio. Kent Chambliss. His name has just been uttered over the radio in New Orleans. So good to see you, brother. All right. Anyway, Joshua. Okay, so we're going to talk Ecology of Souls.
Okay.
Where do I even start?
Yeah, that was my experience when I first sat down for my initial interview after it was completed. And ironically enough, that was with my editor, Barbara Fisher. And I just sort of remember looking at Barbara over Skype or whatever it was and saying, where do I start with this? Because it ended up being such a gigantic, comprehensive sort of look at the way that I think about these topics. It started out as it was just going to be a UFO book, right? Just UFOs and the dead. And it became very apparent as I was wading through older and older books on the belief in the human soul and what it looked like, and to a certain degree what afterlives looked like, that like, oh no, this encompasses, at least from my standpoint, every aspect of the paranormal. There's a case to be made there. And it also became really apparent that if you were just going to write that UFO book, you could do it one of two ways. You could set out to write the UFO book, and you would say something, and then you'd constantly be referring back to you'd constantly be having these digressions, to explain, I don't know, the pervasive worldwide belief in the idea that our souls are small homunculuses, or you'd be referring to the connection between breath and souls. You could always have these constant digressions, or you could just split it into two books and have the first book be about a lot of these older soul traditions, and then the second book be focusing more on the UFO phenomenon. So that's sort
Okay.
of
Tiny homunculi. I have to bite. What the heck is that?
Well, you see this in artistic depictions throughout the classical world, throughout Egyptian art. Obviously, we're getting into. There's another topic that comes into here: polypsychism, the idea that we have multiple souls. So you have the winged Ba and Ka and stuff, all that sort of stuff, in the Egyptian tradition. But you can look back through these traditions in the ancient world and see these ideas that the human soul was one of multiple things: a butterfly, a bird. Those have some bearing on our discussion as well, but also the idea that the human soul is just a tiny person. And you find that idea in some indigenous beliefs in the New World as well. But it's all over a lot of ancient iconography, and this idea that there are these, that upon death, you basically have a tiny person come out of your mouth, usually, because there's that connection between psyche, breath, and also, the soul, and also butterfly.
Mhm.
Already we're in this territory where we're having to cross-reference and mention other things. But I thought that had some degree of bearing on these sort of little people fairy traditions worldwide. And so if we want to sort of pull back and take a look at how this project originated, it came from a couple of different places. And one of them was, of course, Jacques Vallée's seminal 1969 work, Passport to Magonia, where he sort of drew the comparison between the fairy folk and
Mhm.
modern UFO encounters. And look, I'm not I'm not disparaging Dr. Vallée in any way. I'm not fit to tie his sandals. And that book has been a cornerstone of everything that I've done. But there was something that was sort of left on the table in that discussion, which was, well, these fairy traditions look a lot like the UFO stuff. But if you go back further, there could have been a version of Passport to Magonia that was written in 1475 that would have said, "Hey, look, these fairies look a lot like the dead." You know what I mean? And it's true. Like, a lot of the baggage that we have with fairies is a lot of modern invention. Obviously, the wings are one of those things, but the idea of them being elementals or nature spirits in that sense is primarily, not exclusively, but primarily has a lot to do with the influence of theosophy. Um,
Mhm.
and so,
All right, stop right
if
there.
yeah,
Theosophy.
yeah, 19th
Just
century,
yeah.
yeah, 19th century spiritual movement, Helena Blavatsky. It was sort of a precursor and an influence on spiritualism. I've often said that that most of the modern way that we think about the paranormal, not the phenomenon itself, but the way that we think about it, and the way that we discuss it, is just James Shelby Downard and theosophy, because it always seems to go back to those two sources. But theosophy really influenced a lot of the way that we conceptualize these things. Everything from higher selves to things like
Mhm.
Akashic records to arguably the tradition of seances in the West have their origins in theosophy. Theosophy has its roots in early ufology. I mean, a lot of those early contactees were theosophists. But one of the things that,
Russell Targ was a theosophist too.
yeah, Wayne Aho was one of the early contactees who was into theosophy. So if you take a look at where the theosophists picked up a lot of their traditions, it's highly influenced by Rudolf Steiner, who was influenced by Paracelsus, who sort of introduced the idea of elementals. You go back even further than that, definitely in Western Europe, arguably in the Americas, I've found some examples of this as well. And you see communities talking about the fairies in the context of the human dead. Either, oh, you go to the fairies when you die, you can become a fairy when you die, the fairies will take you as you die. Those sort of ideas keep on coming up time and time again. So
So I
I
want to
guess,
raise this just
mhm.
because we had one of our Irish followers here is telling me that banshees began in Sumeria and Babylon. Do you have any knowledge on that, or is that? I mean, it's just
I'm sure,
curious.
off the top of my head, no, but I'm sure that there are antecedents for that. And I think
Mhm.
that, I mean, if you look at a lot of these traditions that we've sort of subsumed into the broader paranormal, a lot of them could be traced back that far. Things like Lilith, the original
Mhm.
wife of Adam, can probably go back to a Mesopotamian air demoness who used to steal children named Lamash too. So there, who knows the original origin for a lot of these things? When you get into the New World, it raises all sorts of questions for how they came up with some similar ideas to what we have. But I guess I was prefacing all that about Passport to Magonia and whatnot. Because I'm trying to say that if you take sort of that transitive property, if today's UFO encounters look a lot like the fairy encounters, and yesterday's fairy encounters looked a lot like the way that people would interact with the dead, then what does that say about that sort of through line? You pile onto this. The number of times that people have seen the deceased in their UFO contact, if not aboard the craft, then in the immediate aftermath of a sighting, things like that. You pile onto this the fact that these UFO encounters look a lot like near-death experiences and look a lot like shamanic initiation. This is stuff that Kenneth Ring and Eddie Bullard have talked about since the 90s and the 70s, respectively. And it starts to form a little bit more of a holistic picture. And then there's always that quote that Anne Strieber said that has always been in the back of my head. Communion comes out, people are sending their experiences to Whitley. Anne's in charge of reading them all and taking notes as she goes. And the one thing that he says that stuck out to him that she had written on top of a yellow sheet of notebook paper was, "This has something to do with what we call death." And that was sort of the driving ethos for trying to unpack this and putting the shamanic initiation in dialogue with near-death experiences and UFO contact and the fairy lore. And it all starts to, there's a certain parsimony there that I appreciate. And so whenever I talk about this topic or this sort of this 2 to 3 work book series, I always like to say that it may not be the answer, and I fully realize that because I've got my own sort of biases and pareidolia at play, but it's an answer that works for me, and it has allowed me to reconcile some outliers that I just didn't know what to do with when I was when I'm looking at some of the stranger stuff in the UFO phenomenon.
Keep going, brother.
Okay. So I started down this path, and I was seeing things, not only the fairy UFO connection, but also I was like, well, let's take a look at some of these other things. Do ley lines play a role? Do ancient monuments play a role? This long-standing association between ancient monuments.
Let's tug at that thread. So
okay.
What, for folks who don't know, what is a ley line and how does that relate to this ecology of souls?
Well, a ley line is ostensibly some sort of power nexus that goes in a straight line that connects multiple sacred sites in a row. First talked about by Alfred Watkins in his book, The Old Straight Path. The actual science.
Like circa when was that? Is that like
oh my
1800s
goodness
book?
I should know this. It's old. It's real old. It's real old. Okay. But ley lines, the actual science, so to speak, of determining where ley lines are is a bit nebulous. If you ask 10 different people, you'll probably get 10 different answers for where they are. But there are some spots that do seem to show sacred sites in alignment. And this, like so many other things, has been adopted by the UFO community. There have been suggestions that UFOs travel along ley lines or use them for navigation or use them as power sources. This is probably part of what inspired Ami Michel to write his book on orthoteny, the idea that there are these great circles that encompass the globe upon which UFOs tend to travel. Orthoteny was eventually abandoned by Dr. Vallée, actually, who sort of ran some simulations and saw that it could be ascribed to chance. But the idea of UFOs traveling these great circles, these lines, has a certain degree of resonance when you also put that up against the number of times that UFOs are supposedly seen around these sacred sites. That was the origin of the window theory idea, the window area idea that John Keel postulated in works like Operation Trojan Horse and whatnot.
Say more with the window theory. Just let people know what that is.
So according to Keel, some of the highest points in an area, often having archaeological sites, would be places of UFO and just paranormal hotspots, radiating out in a 200-mile diameter or 200-mile radius. Now, of course, that size allows you to sort of daisy chain them, especially in places like the East Coast. But there does seem to be something strange about these ancient sites. I do not adhere to the ancient aliens idea. I think very much more along the lines of the idea that these sites oftentimes resemble each other because they were all built by human hands, and the techniques to contact this other place just work, similar to the way that the bow and arrow sort of has its independent evolution in different parts of the world, because it just works, right? But if you take an idea like ley lines and you look at it, it seems to have a lot in common with the work of Paul Devereaux, who has surveyed not only ley lines, but this phenomenon in various parts of the world of death roads. This idea that to transport a corpse from the church to the graveyard, or from the community to the graveyard to their site of interment, a straight road was something that you see in a lot of different places. This is very common in Western Europe. There's an argument to be made that there are similar roadways and pathways in the New World. For example, in South America, the Mayans had Sacbeab, or in, I guess, Mexico, I should restate, Latin America in general. Sacbeab, that are these straight roads. And Devereaux compared this to the idea that he compared it to a lot of things. He compared it to visions of shamanic travel, which might arguably be something that we see with the NDE experience in the tunnel vision. But Devereaux also sort of made the argument that, like, you went straight so that the spirits wouldn't be lost on these pathways. And of course, straight lines, ley lines, there are these traditions that spirits are arrested by complexity. Think of things like mazes or dream catchers. In some African American communities in the rural South, there was once a tradition that you could put a colander on your on your doorstep to keep the devil at bay, or you'd task the devil with, like, counting all the grains of sand on a beach. So something about spirits gets arrested by complexity. So the fact that we see ley lines sort of the fact that we see UFOs traveling in these sort of straight paths, sometimes making abrupt turns, and that has sort of been absorbed into the ufological culture with ley lines, seems to speak to the fact that we are indeed dealing with something that's more metaphysical than a nuts and bolts spacecraft. So, and then you sort of layer on top of that the number of these ancient sites that ended up being sepulchral sites. There's a lot of indications that some Neolithic sites in Western Europe, even if they weren't originally intended for burials, ended up being spots for burials of people like unbaptized infants and things like that. But there are, at the same time, quite a number of, sacrificial burials at sites. I know that I believe that there were some ashes and hundreds of remains that were discovered under the Hill of Tara in Ireland. And of course, the number of burials that you find in North American indigenous mounds from the mound building cultures is the same thing. So we've got these sepulchral burial sites, right? These burial sites that seem to be these attractors of strange phenomena, and they're connected.
When you say sepulchral sites, is there any special definition to, like, a sepulcher that's different than just a grave?
It's a fancy way of saying a grave site.
It's
an academic way of saying a grave site. But,
okay, I was thinking it had some sort of special meaning I wasn't aware of, that it was like a place of, like, mass sacrifice or something like that.
No, you're fine. So, but yes, so you do have these sort of ancient sites that have, all over the place. They have these associations with fairies as being sort of fairy dwellings, and you have these ley lines going between them, and they've built up sort of this ufological legend, these legends in ufology around them. Places like, I think Silbury Hill is an artificial sort of mountain as well, and that has all this sort of UFO stuff attached to it. So there does seem to be a through line that sort of connects all these different topics. And again, death. Like, that's the thing I kept on finding. Now, I already alluded to some of my biases and some of my own pareidolia. there is something to be said for the fact that whenever we conceptualized the more than human world or the spirit world writ large, that we were always thinking about how that related to our deaths. But at the same time, um, when you put that again up against some of these other things that you've seen more recently in ufology, like the dead loved ones appearing in contact, it starts to form a more cohesive picture.
All right, so you have these burial sites attached to ley lines, and there's also kind of connected to the UFO phenomenological genre, let's just call it.
Mm-hmm.
Where does it stand today? Like, are these things still a common association that people see in abductions, visitations, things like that?
Specifically, so are you talking about dead people in UFO contact, or are you talking about an association of UFOs with some of these ancient sites? I mean, the answer to both is kind of yes, so I guess it doesn't really matter which question you are asking.
Yeah, let's focus on the first one, though. That's for in terms of
Right.
the dead associated with UFO encounters.
Right. Well, if you take sort of a look at the literature, the original plan was to go to Rice University and go through the archives of the impossible and all that correspondence that Ann and Whitley got. The pandemic sort of put that plan on hold. But even if you just do sort of so Ecology of Souls was conceived as one book and split into two books with a third volume just for appendices and bibliography and whatnot, just a function of how big the project got. But I have 3 appendices in the companion to Ecology of Souls that lists just the published accounts that I could find of people who have encountered dead loved ones, either aboard the craft or in the aftermath of a sighting or during a time when they've had a lot of UFO activity. There are a couple of interpretations of this, right? A lot of the traditional extraterrestrial hypothesis adherents would say that these are all screen memories. Maybe, maybe I can't say that they're not. But at the same time, when I take a look at all these other things, again, it's about sort of the sum of all the data that points in this direction, and the fact that as well as I do, poltergeist phenomena tends to pop off in UFO experiencers' lives. Valet said that was the rule rather than the exception. So putting a pin in that. There's also something that I've wondered is, I think we tend to overemphasize things like greys and reptilians and insectoids. If you really look across the whole of CE 3s and 4s, you will find that a large amount of these UFO occupants just appear human. And, I'm not saying that UFOs are staffed by the human dead, but if you didn't know the people when they were alive, you're not going to recognize them when they're dead, right? So that's a possibility worth entertaining. There's also, in the free study that Ray Hernandez put together, there were suggestions that in addition to just regular appearing humans aboard these craft, that light beings, these sort of glowing humanoids, were more common than grays and things like that. And of course, light beings are a staple of near-death experiences. Like, that's one of the most common things. So people, dead people, and light beings, both in near-death experiences and in the UFO literature. And I don't need to lecture you on the UFO NDE similarities that were pointed out by Kenneth Ring and some other folks. But
well, let's go there really quickly for people who are less familiar.
Yeah, I mean, they're both narratives of ascent, right? And you've got this sort of rushing headlong towards a bright light. I wouldn't be surprised, I'm not making this claim, but I wouldn't be surprised if half of the alien abductions that we see involve some aspect of autoscopy, of seeing yourself, seeing your body as you're being taken somewhere. So there's sort of an OBE, out of body experience component to it. One of the things that Ring made great points to emphasize was the sort of after effects that both UFO experiencers, contactees, alien abductees, what have you, the similarities that they notice in their lives after their contact, that was also noticed by people who had survived near-death experiences. The poltergeist effects is one of them. Other psi phenomena are another thing. Synchronicities, improved personal changes to their lifestyle, an increased sense of mission, sensitivities to certain things. Like it lines up very tidily. And so you had, actually, I found the comparison that Keel made between NDEs and the UFO experience back in like the 70s. So it wasn't actually Ring who sort of was the first one to say that, but he definitely was the one to sort of popularize and bring that idea to the fore. So, kudos to him in that regard. But you have these people over here saying, look, UFO encounters and NDEs look very similar. And then you have another body of scholarship put forth by folks like Eddie Bullard, Simon Harvey Wilson, who has passed on. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on the similarities between shamanic initiations and UFO contact. And there are extensive similarities there as well. One of the things that I think is best to point to is the dismemberment motif. A lot of these shamanic initiations involve going to the spirit world, being taken apart and having new things put into your body and being put back together again so that you can be a vector for the spirit world when you come back. But, and of course, shamanism is very specific to Northern Eurasia, but you can sort of discern a semi-shamanic shape to a lot of other people who serve the role as intercessors between the human world and the spirit world in a variety of cultures. So just addressing that. So you've got NDEs and UFO experiences look the same. Shamanic initiations and UFO experiences look similar. I shouldn't say the same. I should say similar. And there's this thing that doesn't get talked about too much, which is the fact that a lot of these shamanic initiations are basically near-death experiences. And I'm painting with a very broad brush there. But this is something that has been noted in scholarship. Dr. Gregory Shushan, who was a one-time Oxford professor, has written a couple of books on ancient concepts of the afterlife and indigenous near-death experiences. And he remarked on the number of near-death experiences and in these different cultures and how they tended to influence ideas of shamanic initiation, to the extent that in places like Australia, he actually argued that we didn't have many near-death experiences, perhaps because they were always viewed within a shamanic context. So the idea, again, with a lot of these shamanic initiations is that you are either willingly or accidentally, through illness or a lightning strike or something, brought to or beyond the edge of death. Then you come back and you have these powers. It seems to me to be the same dadgum story over and over and over again, because you have a lot of these different things. There are similar sounds that are reported. There are similar sensations similar emotional sensations. There are similar interiors. There are similar exteriors. Fairy. I haven't even talked about the fairy stuff. Sorry, I'm a little bit all over the place.
It's not. Well, I just interviewed somebody a few days ago. I mean, the video has not appeared on the site yet because I haven't edited it yet. But he's been able to have a lot of these experiences with using the N-dimethyltryptamine pathway.
That's part of it too,
right?
Yeah.
But literally, not portions of a near-death experience, so like the classic life review. He also has had an abduction experience with, and he got there just using this dimethyltryptamine or DMT basically. So again, another pathway to get there, but very, very similar. And the way he described the abduction experience, he said it was as if I was sitting in this chair, and he's like, I knew that I took this aid, but it's almost like you just went to another reality or dimension. There are people who disappear, who disappear for an entire lifetime. Apparently. Anyway, sorry, I never throw that in there. But
I've read some horrifying trips of people who have smoked Salvia divinorum and have spent like 40 years as a piece of unused luggage underneath a stairway. like just really
Did they come back crazy? Because that's the other thing. Like, what does that do to your psyche?
I mean, you hear these stories about people having entire lives sometimes and coming back, and they actually are emotional about it because they're like, I had a family and friends and all these different things in this other space. But I think that so you can see how this project is sort of kept on multiplying and multiplying. And the altered states of consciousness thing is really important. You know, you mentioned DMT. One of the things that that Terence McKenna claimed to have done was to turned a very prominent Tibetan Lama onto DMT, and a household name that you would recognize. And he said that's as close as you can get without passing the point of no return. Those are the lesser lights. And Terence started using the phrase bungee cording into the bardo and whenever you take DMT. So again, this idea that this chemical is somehow taking you to that place and allowing you to come back. It's interesting because if you look at some of those Tibetan traditions, there have been scholarly papers that have been written on monks who are actually able in certain forms of meditation to enter a near-death experience-like state. And part of the reason that they would meditate was so that they would not become disoriented upon the point of death. And then you've got this tight interplay between other psychoactive substances and disciplines like shamanism. And you have people who, had a near-death experience and then started seeing UFOs, or, chicken and the egg sort of thing, saw UFOs all their life and then had a near-death experience.
Or starts having poltergeist encounters, seeing shadow people, all sorts of things like that. Yeah.
And so, like, if I had to sort of sum up where I'm at with this, like, I think that there was this beautiful quote that Mike Cleland recorded in conversation with Joe Lewells. And Joe said, there's a certain amount of shamans that the universe needs, and we're not fulfilling our quota. And if we don't provide shamans, then the universe will. I'm basically paraphrasing it. And it seems like that's what's happening in a lot of these. Like, there's space that you can go to, and people are being called to do something. But when we don't send enough people, and we don't have a way to integrate them into our society, it seems like there's some sort of mechanism that's in place to put these people into our culture. But that's what I'm getting at. And that's why, whenever I talk about Ecology of Souls, I sound a little bit like a madman, is because there is this sort of parsimonious is the word that I would always use, this really parsimonious interplay between all these different things. And I don't think it's really groundbreaking in the sense that, like, people have made these connections, but they haven't, again, put them in dialogue with one another. I was talking about some of these spaces that you go into. One of the things that you see in some of these DMT narratives is this idea of this domed space, which sounds not only like the interiors of some UFOs, but I've also found something very similar in some NDE accounts. But you also get sometimes these under other substances, you can enter this sort of pastoral realm. And what did all the contactees say that places like Venus and Jupiter looked like? Pastoral realms. You'll even find modern alien abductees who claim to visit other planets, and they see similar sort of rolling countrysides with a city of shimmering light in the distance. And that's right out of Raymond Moody's near-death studies, like one of the first things that he noticed. It's also fairyland, to be quite frank, down to things like...
Are you familiar with the science fiction or fantasist, I'd probably call him, Clark Ashton Smith, and like the City of the Shining Lights or something like that?
I have heard of this, but I don't think I've read any of his work. No.
It's like all of this, right? He just goes to this place in Northern California in the mountains, and there's like a portal there, and they get to this city. There's all these different entities, and there's just this shimmering light that they're all attracted to, and all these beings are just kind of like stepping through it. And the story starts is because his friend disappeared, and he was somehow able to leave this place without getting drawn into to me, it sounds like a galactic bug zapper, but you don't really know.
Right. Well, that's a whole other discussion that we can have too. Yeah.
Yeah. But at the end, the guy leaves a note saying, I had to go back to the city of the shimmering lights or the shining lights or whatever. And it just ends. But it has a lot of these sort of themes. And this guy was writing in like the 1930s or even before then.
Well, the way that you're describing it, it sounds like it has almost sort of an Arthur Machen sort of flair to it too. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he was one of those folks.
I'm absolutely aware of his work. Same like Algernon Blackwood is another. John, like the Willows. He's got all sorts of. If you start reading Lovecraft, you'll eventually work your way backwards to a lot of these folks.
Yeah. Well, so I guess one thing that I kind of discovered on this journey is that um, the UFO is a clearinghouse for all these old beliefs. I mean, that's just where we just piled everything into it and act like it's science, and it's not really science. I mean, there are scientific things you can
Well,
do. I'm not saying that,
it might be. It's
but
just a level of science that is far beyond our comprehension. It's like the
right, right.
Arthur C. Clarke. It might as well be any sophisticated technological organization is, you know, basically seems like magic to somebody that's much less
Right.
sophisticated.
And of course, Jeff Kripal turned that on its head and said any sufficiently advanced magic appears like technology. So if that sort of chiasmus holds true, one would expect that. But here's the thing that I found really sort of one of the more compelling motifs, I guess you'd say, that I sort of stumbled on, is that for a lot of us, we those of us who are sort of mired in modernity think about the afterlife, if we think about it at all, as being just somewhere else, maybe another dimension if you really want to pin us down, but like we don't really put a place in it. But for a lot of, indigenous cultures, it was a place on earth. It was, on the other side of that mountain range. Oh, it's an island out to sea with the setting sun. It was, an undiscovered country, this and that and the other. And then when human beings map practically the entire planet, what happens to that belief? I would argue it gets transposed to the stars. And this seems no more apparent to me than if you look at the image of the flying saucer, right? One of the most pernicious symbols that we see in shamanism and in just concepts of the afterlife is the boat. I spend a great deal of time in Ecology of Souls talking about
what about the boatman? What about the boatman? Yeah, there you go.
Psychopomps. Yeah. So but it's not just Karen going across the river Styx. It's a theme that you see over and over and over again. A lot of our ancestors co-opted canoes for coffins.
By the way, I had the most when you said Karen, my mind.
Yeah, I know, right?
And I just thought like
Charon, but yeah.
Yeah. Why are you wearing those clothes? Like, I think I'm gonna I think Hades is gonna have an issue with this. I need to call Hades. Like, you need anyway. Sorry,
yeah.
I'm off.
Don't be such a Charon, right? No, I looked it up. It is Karen, but it makes
I believe you.
Kind
that's
of
why
funny,
that's why I didn't correct. I'm just telling you what I'm like. Yeah, exactly. But, keep going. Sorry.
But so a lot of these psychopomps did incorporate boat imagery, and there were I mentioned you can find Chinese coffin burials using canoes. Ships were grave goods to the Egyptians, to the Norse. There were such things as Viking burials, although they didn't usually look like they do in popular fiction. But also there were these ship effigies that sometimes were built around Norse burials of sort of this elliptic, almost Vesica Piscis kind of shape around these burials. So the ship is this huge death symbol, psychopomp symbol, and shaman symbol, because shamans were also psychopomps too, sometimes depending on the culture, which of course it's you hear about that and you're like, of course they were, right? And I just can't help but see UFOs as being another expression of that. It's a transportation obsessed discipline. Ufology is, right? You're like, where do they come from? Where are they going? Where are they taking me? Those sort of questions. And this is an idea that's been mentioned here and there across the literature, but again, nobody, I don't think, had really taken the time to sort of take a look at UFOs and perhaps their occupants as being psychopomps. Carl Jung, in his essay on flying saucers, made the remark back in, what was that, 50-something? 58, maybe, I think. The idea of the UFO as a sort of Karen is an idea that I've not encountered in the literature thus far. And then you start to unpack what some of these indigenous cultures say about things like star people and things like, UFOs and flying saucers. Cynthia Hind, who did a lot of work in bringing some of these indigenous African stories to the Western world of ufology, only was able to accomplish that because she started asking the right questions. She kept on asking about spacemen and extraterrestrials and wasn't getting anywhere. But when she started talking about ancestors and when she started talking about spirits, she started seeing these things happening. You can see the same through line running all through the work of R.D. Sixkiller Clarke with indigenous North American and South American cultures as well, where there is this conflation of stars and ancestors and, quite frankly, a lot of times no real distinction between ancestor and occupant and craft. I mean, there's a story that I found in, I believe it's Artie's book on North America. I can never keep the two titles straight, but where an indigenous North American informant talked about having a conversation with a star person who turned into a ball of light, then went up into the sky, joined a couple of other balls of light, formed a black triangle, and then left. It's weird, man. It's weird. But this idea of lights as beings, I mean, so many UFO sightings are just lights. And
well, actually, let's stop right there as an example. So let's take Fukushima. When that was happening, there were a lot of orbs that were observed in the sky. And usually not usually, but sometimes when there are a lot of deaths in a particular period or at an event, there are a lot of orbs that are observed. Is that kind of related to this, where that could be the transition into death of the souls as they're released from their quote unquote mortal coils?
Could be a lot of things in that vein. So if I can explain, I look at a lot of worldwide folklore. I don't use the term universal very often, but the conceptualization of the human soul as an orb of light is pretty much universal. And it's also context dependent in the paranormal, right? You know, you see it in the house and it's a ghost, and you see it in the sky and it's a UFO. You see it above an old Neolithic stone circle and it's a fairy, right? Like, these are the sort of contexts that we've been working in. There's a lot of light phenomena that happens around the time of death. You have NDE experiencers who describe transforming into a ball of light as part of their experience. But there's also another thing that needs to be considered here, and this gets a little bit strange, but one of the other things that Jung talked about in his essay on flying saucers is he made comparisons of the circular shape of the saucer to a mandala, a totality symbol, the human soul. The idea that flying saucers or that UFOs are souls does not sit well with a lot of people in 2024. But once you start picking at that, you start saying, well, you know, a lot of these UFO sightings are just lights. And here's the other thing. They happen often, obviously not exclusively, but they happen often at night when there are these lights. And there were certain conditions in which the human soul could wander: illness, altered states of consciousness, including sleep, when people tend to see these things. But also, you know, people who are astral projecting. The shamans, the magicians, the witches, the sorcerers, all these sort of magical practitioners, whenever they would leave their body, it would be described in indigenous cultures, in Western Europe, in a lot of different places, as being a ball of light. So there's this idea that maybe we're just seeing people's souls wandering around in the sky. It sounds wild, but it's consistent through folklore. And it gets even a little bit stranger, because I kind of wonder, you know, you talk to these UFO experiencers who see the craft and they feel some sort of deep connection to it, and they feel as though they are in some sort of trance. Are they looking at their own soul? It's a weird idea, but it has some precedence in the idea of the doppelganger. You know, we're often familiar with the doppelganger as being a duplicate of yourself that you see, and it's often a death omen. But the reason that it's a death omen is not that it necessarily causes death, but that it's a symptom of the bonds between body and soul weakening, right? That's really what it's more about. Because you're weakened, your soul is sort of having its own autonomy and it's going about its business. And there's also a line of, a lot of these lights, depending on the culture, you know, in Wales, they were called corpse candles. They would be seen before a death in the community. So there's this idea that these lights are seen before a death in the community. Chris Albeck was kind enough to share with me an unpublished article of a survey from somewhere in the Midwest. I believe it was either Missouri or Illinois. Pardon me for not remembering which, but it was just an entire it was like a census that was done in this community, and there was an entire section that was just devoted to light phenomena preceding people's deaths. And light phenomena, balls of light preceding people's deaths, you see in a lot of different contexts. So there is that sort of precedent there, again, for this to be an aspect of the soul that is traveling. Now, I say aspect of the soul because if you look back in these older traditions, there is sometimes this idea that we don't have a soul. We have multiple souls. Depending upon when you're looking at in the Egyptian timeline, up to 9 souls, in some Norse traditions, 3 souls. But this idea that there's
when you say that in
Mm-hmm.
these traditions, are they these souls kind of all the same substance, or are they just different aspects? And like each soul is somehow different, like a different
Right. Well,
body.
they tend to be depicted differently. You've got things like the Ba and the Ka, which were a winged person or a dwarf in Egyptian iconography. You've got the Philia, which is sort of an animal follower that you'd see in Norse cosmologies. But we still sort of have a little bit of this today, and we talk about it, but we don't acknowledge it. We'll say things like, well, my head wants to do this, but my heart wants to do this. And that really is a polypsychic way of viewing your emotions and viewing the self, is that there are conflicting aspects or conflicting parties within you with their own sort of motivations. And so there was the belief that if not your singular soul, there was an aspect of yourself that could sort of go off and do its own thing under certain conditions. Again, like illness, like trance, like sleep. And then now we're into werewolf territory. You see what I mean?
Right, let me stop you right there. Just for folks joining right now, you're listening to Through a Glass Darkly Radio on United Public Radio, and I'm interviewing Joshua Cutchin. Okay, werewolves, go.
Well, yeah, so I think werewolves are important in this discussion. And again, you see what I'm talking about. Tell me you see why this became this big thing, is because it does end up touching on all these other different things.
You have a very complicated Venn diagram, is basically.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. I have heard these stories of Dogman, right? We hear these stories nowadays, and no one's going to catch a Dogman. No one's going to kill a Dogman. I'll put my money down right now for that. Bigfoot, I can leave some wiggle room because there's something like it in the fossil record, but there's just nothing like Dogman in the fossil record. But people see these things, and they're really earnest about it. So what happens
like
when
physical poltergeists, basically?
I mean, yeah, there's
fear
argument to be made that, yeah.
Right.
But you talk to some of these people, and they're very earnest, and I have no reason to think that they're making it up. So let's just go with this, and let's reframe it in that context of werewolves. We think about lycanthropy being a physical transformation of the self into some sort of half human, half wolf thing, but there are indications in a lot of the older texts that it was, again, if not the soul, an aspect of the soul that would go out and be, not necessarily a half human, half wolf or something, but like, just an actual, what appears to be an actual wolf with these uncanny talents, but not just wolves, zoomorphic souls is an entire sort of topic that has been talked about. And this has some degree of bearing on our alien abduction discussion, not only for this idea of wandering souls and orbs in the sky that we've been talking about, but also for the fact that one of the ways that you would tell who was a werewolf is if you shot at the wolf and it hit the wolf's, right shoulder, and there was a person who was acting strange in the village who, woke up and they had a wound on their right shoulder, you'd be like, oh, they're the werewolf. But there was rarely the implication that it was a physical wound, the same physical wound on the same body, right? The soul was wounded and it manifested on the body.
It's and like that a bruise or something like that, right?
Yeah, and that puts me in the mindset of things like stigmata. It puts me in the mindset of dream injuries, which Jenny Randall's talked about a bit. But it also puts me in the mindset of something like alien abduction. It provides a mechanism by which an out-of-body experience can somehow manifest physical wounds, scoop marks, those sort of things that we hear about with abductees on the body. Now, again, in the interest of being completely intellectually honest, there are plenty of alien abductions that do seem to be much more embodied. Let's put it that way. You have these stories of people whose cars are picked up and, and taken these vast distances. There was a famous example that I found of a couple in, at the time it was, called Rhodesia, but there was this couple that was transported hundreds of miles and didn't have any gas taken out of the tank, and they had been sort of followed by UFOs, on their trip, and there was a hypnotic regression.
Just for context, I'm just going to add this: when a bunch of the remote viewers in Project Stargate remote viewed these 4 bases, one of the bases was in Zimbabwe, which is modern day Rhodesia, or most of it is modern day Rhodesia. Anyway,
Thank you.
just context.
The name of the modern country just completely left my mind. But since you mentioned it, I actually brought up the case here so I can be a little bit more accurate. May 31st, 1974, a couple by the name of Peter and Frances, who were being, again, followed by this UFO, and their car was picked up and apparently traveled a vast distance. No fuel was spent according to the fuel gauge, but there was a hypnotic regression that was applied, and Peter, who just so happened to have dabbled in astral travel himself, even though the car was moved. So we've got a really physical case here. Even though the car was moved, Peter, who had happened to have had OBEs in the past, said that the experience that he remembered under hypnosis was very much like the initial stages of the OBEs that he'd had. He made that direct comparison. He also had an interesting thing to add, which ties into our ley line discussion earlier. He said that they went through a dead straight line across the sky. And dead straight is the phrase that appears time and time and time again in Paul Devereaux's work on these corpse roads that the body was to travel on between these sacred sites. So again, I can't say that that's an out-of-body experience because the dadgum car was moved, but there are these allusions to it around the margins that suggest that there's something metaphysical going on, at least to a certain degree. And that's something else that I really wish people, I think we might have talked about this a little bit on our last discussion, but we don't have.
And for folks who know me through Glass Darkly Radio, you can find it on Through a Glass Darkly with Sean on YouTube channel. Anyway, sorry, Josh, you kind of gave me a layup. I had to do it. Sorry.
No, you're fine. You're fine. And I wasn't rolling my eyes. I was actually closing the document that I had open a second ago. I think we really misapprehend this physical, non-physical dichotomy. One of the things that people say to me when I entertain the idea that Bigfoot is somehow something other than a large primate is they'll say things like, "Oh, well, ghosts don't leave footprints." And it's like, no, they do. Like, that was the first ghost hunting technique, was to put talcum powder on the floor. Similarly, psi phenomena is this internal thing that seems to interact with consensus reality. So our understanding of what these two things are is really poor. And what I have been saying lately is I suspect that UFOs are an inversion of humanity, by which I mean human beings seem predominantly physical with an important component that is psychic. And I suspect maybe that these things in general, but UFOs specifically, are predominantly psychic with an important component that is physical. They can sort of come into this physical space the same way that we can go into the psychic space. But whatever it is, that line that separates these two things, internal, external, physical, mental, arguably fiction, nonfiction, I think, is a lot more porous than we have been led to believe, I think.
And do you think this is all part of the same substance or reality, or do you think these are all different things? They're just using the same pathways. So, as an example, to be completely not transparent but clear, is it that the dead are also using the same pathways as actual ETs, or the actual ETs manifestations of the dead, and they're all kind of just non-corporeal representations of similar kind of entity or substance, or again, just a multiverse of different entities that occupy this space?
It's a good question, and it's kind of encoded in the title of the book, Ecology of Souls. One of the things that I run into when I start going down this particular avenue is, and I sympathize with this. I'm a Christian. But you do get this reductive Judeo-Christian good versus evil thing that crops up, the spiritual warfare stuff that we always see whenever there's a disclosure season. And I just don't think I think that we see such a diversity in ecosystems here on Earth. I can't help but imagine that this other space wouldn't have a plethora of things that fill various niches, much in the same way that we see that in things like ecosystems. And
even a Christian, or even a Christian Catholic might see, let's take demons. So I'm just throwing that out there. It could also just be a set of beings that feed on fear, or feed on and it's just, that's what we've called them historically. Anyway, I'm not making I'm not trying to sell any idea or one other, but these things can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. Right.
You're speaking directly, though, to something that I was about to say, which is I think that there probably are things that are inclined to positivity and goodness, and there are things that are inclined towards negativity and badness.
But even that, though, it just could be where they are in the food chain, right? Like something that
and then there's a spectrum
moral
of things.
And good might feed on. I mean, I'm sure if we look at cattle, right, we're not exactly love and light. Maybe we're mixed. The people who feed you, but there's also like we also eat them, right? And they may not even know that we eat them, right?
Well, tornadoes and sharks are not evil, but
exactly.
Their behavior does not often align with your own interests. Yeah, and so I think that that's probably a more accurate read on whatever this other realm is. You cannot get away from the stellar flavor of the UFO phenomenon, and you cannot get away from the physicality of the UFO phenomenon. So you kind of have to find a way to reconcile all these different things. There was a quote that I believe it was Lori Barnes said to Whitley Strieber. No, it wasn't Lori. She said something different. I'm remembering something differently. One of the visitors told Whitley Strieber, "We're the recyclers of souls." And that certainly is consistent with this sort of psychopomp idea that I've been talking about here, and then I try my best to flesh out in the book. Part of the reason that it's 2 books is because that's a very long argument to set up. Like, you have to really set up that argument before you drop that on people. But recyclers of souls. Leo Sprinkle referred to the Greys as sheepdogs, sort of keeping human souls in line. And that's another motivation for writing this book that I had, because I don't like stories of reincarnation and pre-birth memories in my UFO literature. I just don't. But if I'm being intellectually honest, those stories aren't going anywhere, and they've been baked into this thing since the 50s, So there has to be a way to sort of integrate those stories into this larger framework and have it still make sense. So look, is it actual extraterrestrials from another planet doing this stuff? I don't know. My own suspicions are that distinctions on the other side of the veil don't really matter. I am very sympathetic towards what we would call animism. That is a problematic term. It's an early anthropological term. It's rooted in ideas of primitivism. I'm very sympathetic to that idea. to the extent that, like, I wonder, one of the most pervasive
Again,
metaphors
for
that we
folks who are like just coming in, working at the gas station, and they're like hearing animism and panpsychism, and they're like, "What the f is going on with these?" Just quickly, just explain both to the extent that you
well,
can, because I'm sure there's a subtle nuance between the two that I'm not bright enough to under. I know there is a subtle nuance, but
yeah, well, and I'm not entirely sure I'm prepared right now at 10:30 at night
high
but
level,
I
high
can't, but I
level. What
can say
what's animism? What's panpsych? Is like high
what I
level.
will say, is that it's this idea that everything is ensouled. So meaning, a lot of people sort of conflate this with, like, oh yeah, I think that dogs and trees have souls too, and it's like, no, it gets it's a little bit more comprehensive than that. It's the idea that mountains are ensouled, and rivers, and weather systems, and the Gulf Stream, and all these sort of things have their
Yeah,
own
they
sort
have
of.
some quantum of consciousness, basically.
Right, right. Um, and again, I'm very sympathetic to that, but so that's part of the reason that I suspect. Well, again, it works for me. It doesn't have to work for everyone. But one of the most pervasive metaphors that we see when we talk about our final transition is rivers going to the sea. We hear that all the time. But what happens to those rivers when they empty into the sea? I mean, it all just sort of mixes up, right?
It
So,
evaporates, and the
and
cycle
then
begins
falls
again. It's the
again.
water
Yeah,
cycle.
exactly.
It's the water cycle.
Yeah,
Right.
precisely. And I think that that's a metaphor that works for me and what's going on. So in that sense, the distinctions of, like, whatever these, for lack of a better term, words are bad, they just don't make sense, spirits, whatever the grays are, whatever the UFO occupants are, I don't even know if it's worth making the distinction whether or not they're extraterrestrial, because if you look at it from that perspective, they're 50% of them is from 1,000 other planets where they were once, algae on another planet that lived and died. And it's also part of my old Dell laptop computer that I threw away in 2008. And it's partially, you know what I mean? It's just a lot of different things coming together. So I don't know if I just know that how it appears to us. And it appears as some sort of animating principle that I suspect has something to do with that reincarnative process. And I think that there's a lot of compelling evidence for something like reincarnation. If you look at the work of Dr. Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker, they did some great work on that.
Mhm.
We don't have to have the reincarnation discussion right now, but it also provides a way for me to sort of resituate this human alien hybrid program that we're seeing. There's there are these constant allusions to babies in vats, and these combination of the human and the alien. I mean, that's like, these hybrids are, to get all fancy, they're the coincidentia oppositorum, they're the philosopher's stone, they're the combination of two very different things. I would argue the physical and the spiritual, but you could probably say the human and the alien just as well. But I kind of wonder if those baby incubator scenarios that we see in the work of people like David Jacobs isn't
Mhm.
just an expression, a poetic expression of the sort of reincarnation process. We're seeing how the sausage is made, so to speak. And that's why you get people who claim to be human alien hybrids but don't have any strange genetic markers. That's how you get these stories of aliens walking among us. Well, yeah, that's because we are in some sense already the alien. We're just incorporating a higher aspect of ourselves into the lower aspect of ourselves. um Again, there's a lot of speculation mixed up in here, but it's all about trying to
Yeah.
reconcile all these wild things that I have had a tendency to avoid, and trying to be honest with myself and being like, well, these stories aren't going anywhere. You got to address them. You got to find something that works. So again, that's part of why I say that Ecology of Souls is a model that works for me. And it might not be the answer, but it's allowed me to sort of make all these different topics play well together in a way that feels cohesive to me.
Well, you mentioned Ray Hernandez at the Free Institute at the very beginning of our conversation, and he's the one who famously had the experience where he was sitting in his car and he saw like a roulette wheel or
Yeah.
something like that, and it had all these sorts of experiences like abduction experiences and remote viewing and astral travel and all that stuff. And the message that he got is it's all the same.
Yeah. And I have yet to meet someone who is, well, that's not true. I know plenty of people, but maybe let's just scratch that. A lot of people I look up to who have spent the time digging into this stuff walk away with the same sensation, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I just saw a clip circulating a little while back where George Knapp was, I didn't see the context of it, but George Knapp was talking with someone and saying you can't separate the supernatural stuff from the UFO stuff. Like it's
Right.
part of it. You can't take it apart and, you know, say you're just studying. You know, you can try to figure out the propulsion and the anti-gravity, and that's if you want to do that, that's fine. But you can't omit the extended consciousness stuff because it seems to definitely be a part of it. And then from that, honestly, with the way that these topics cross-pollinate, it's a hop, skip, and a jump to Bigfoot and fairies and all this other stuff. Although I certainly would caution against people interpreting these things literally. Like, you know, what do the giant relict hominids have to do with the extraterrestrials? Like, it just seems like there are different masks and formations that are playing on our own cultural expectations and our own baggage, and, you know, they're anticipating our reactions. And so I guess in that sense, yeah, I am a pan paranormalist, but I think that there's a lot of diversity in the function that these things fulfill.
Then what do you think the probability is that they're just manifestations of our own consciousness, i.e., that we're subconsciously generating more of this stuff than we realize?
I hate that idea, but I have to admit it's a possibility. So
It's like the Tulpa thought form thing,
yeah,
right?
well,
I don't like the idea either, but yeah.
well, but I have to sit back and say, why do you not like that idea? And I say to myself, Josh, it's because there is a 12-year-old inside you who wants there to be something weird out there. You know what I mean? Like, it kind of feels like, oh, if it's all generated by me, then it feels less enchanted, I guess. But that's another reason that the topic grew so big, because every one of these things that I'm talking about do interface with ideas like higher selves and projections of the self. If we're talking about polypsychism and doppelgangers and these sort of aspects of the self that can be seen by the self, then you have to entertain the idea that it is somehow a projection. I'm working on something right now that is hopefully going to concretize my thoughts on the Tulpa egregore thought form thing a little bit more, but I tend to think that, I don't know. I want it to be something exteriorized, but you do hear these things know us better than we know ourselves. That's a constant refrain that you hear in the experiencer stories. And then you have these cryptic things that these aliens will say, like, I am the thee within me and stuff like that. That really sort of point towards some form of monism, if you're, you know, talking about religious studies and the idea that everything is one and everything is an expression of the one. Like, it does point to that. And again, at that point, what difference do distinctions make? But there's also an entire chapter in volume 2 that's dedicated to cryptids and how they reflect the death motif. One of the things that I think is really interesting is the number of Bigfoot reports where not only are people paced out of the woods and, you know, their footsteps are mirrored by the footsteps of something in the forest and they stop and the thing stops, but people who actually see Bigfoot that imitate the person that they're watching. It's like, is that sort of an expression of the is it a projection of the self? And then you start going down this path of the anima mundi, and, you know, the gray, the UFO occupants being an expression of the higher self and Bigfoot being the lower self, the animalistic self. And you're kind of like, I don't know. And, you know, the trick is to, I think, depending on whether or not you measure Ecology of Souls as a success, I think that the trick is to touch on these ideas and play with these ideas and to make a case for them, but to not really marry yourself to any of these ideas. And so that was sort of an interesting needle to thread over the course of the project.
Okay, so you mentioned Mike Cleland earlier in this broadcast, as well as psychopomps. What's the deal with owls?
Well, again, I just kept finding things that felt really comprehensive. There's an entire subset of animals that we associate with UFOs. I would argue that dogs, horses, and birds, specifically owls, but dogs, horses, and birds are things that you see time and time again. Guess, Sean, what the three most common shamanic and psychopomp animals are. They're dogs, horses, and owls. The association between birds and death is, again, almost universal. I said I don't
Mhm.
use that word often, but it's really close. The soul conceptualized as a bird is an image that you see across a variety of cultures. Birds as death omens, sometimes in some cultures, owls. Um, but again, all these sort of animals embody the themes that you would want to have with a a leader of some sort, be it a shaman or a psychopomp or a shaman serving as a psychopomp. Um, by which I mean birds can reach places that human beings cannot. Dogs are loyal companions, and we don't think of them being as modes of travel, but for people, at the North Pole, they certainly are. Um, and then horses are obviously, an important travel symbol. So again, it's that encoding of the travel symbol, the encoding of the idea of reaching distant places that human beings cannot otherwise reach. Boats, horses, birds, to a lesser extent, dogs. And there are plenty of stories with strange dogs going back to the contactee era, some sightings of UFOs with large amounts of dogs. I chronicle those in the book. The bird UFO thing is really strange, but this starts to make sense of what the role that the owls might play. They're just another one of these psychopomp symbols that's cropping up in UFO sightings. There was one story, I've made several allusions to these stories that I didn't know what to do with.
Mhm.
Another story that I've heard from several people, but the example that I provide in the book came from Barbara Fisher because I thought hers was so very interesting. This these stories of UFOs that turn into birds. I don't know if you've run across these, but like I've heard that before. And it's like, you hear that and you're like, I don't know what to do with this. And you could go down the screen memory route. But Barbara shared a story where she was on a walk with her mother, and Barbara saw an inverted bowl flying saucer doing a stair step down the sky over West Virginia, and her mom remembered nothing of the sort. What did she remember? She remembered a large red bird. And I just think if we're looking at Carl Jung's speculation of the UFO as a soul and the symbol of
Mhm.
the bird as the soul, it starts to have some consistency there that quite frankly, every other model that I've looked at has lacked to not only explain that sort of weird thing, but also things like Dogman or pre-birth memories or reincarnation in UFO stories. So um, that was another reason that the project was so enticing to me, and it kind of scares me a little bit because one of my mentors is Greg Bishop, and he has drilled it in my head that you should never sort of get stuck in your own belief systems. I mean, there's a little bit of Robert Anton Wilson in there too, but you shouldn't get stuck in your own belief systems. You should always be trying to evolve and reevaluate your suspicions. And I don't want to say that I'm stuck on the ecology of souls model, because I'm not. Again, I'm working on some other projects that are touching on different things, but um, there's something really attractive about it that still resonates with me to this day. And if I have a hope for the project as a whole, it's that it would be sort of put alongside some of these alternatives to the extraterrestrial hypothesis,
Mhm.
because there's just there's a lot of things there that suggest that there is a connection, and it's been there with us again from the beginning of ufology. you know a lot of those early contactees were talking about souls and reincarnation, and like I said, there were spiritualists and theosophists, and it's still there in the contemporary stuff if you know to look for it. I mean, I would say more often than not, the UFO occupants speak to experiencers about things like souls and universal consciousness and these other topics that have long been considered taboo. And that's been the axe that I've had to grind with the extraterrestrial hypothesis adherents for a while now, is that, like, look, even if they're aliens, they're, I won't swear, even if they're aliens, they're freaking weird aliens, right? They're really, really strange, and they are confrontations to everything we think we know about reality and spirituality and science. I mean, the UFO is just, well, appropriately enough, the title of one of Vallee's books, right? Confrontations. It's a confrontation to everything. And I think that's one of the things about it that endures the most.
Now, we talked about dogmen. What's the deal with dogmen and all this stuff?
Well, I alluded to those 3 psychopomp animals that you see time and time again. One of them is dogs. The incidence of dog imagery in psychopomps, you can find examples of it in China and Greece and Scandinavian countries. Obviously in Egypt, the dog-headed Anubis, his sometimes conflated deity Wepawet, but also, Saint Christopher was syncretized with Anubis to form Hermanubis. So you'll sometimes get this sort of like Catholic Saint Christopher with a dog's head. It's kind of strange, but it's a thing. But what is Saint Christopher the patron saint of? Travel. So again, that's the travel theme that you see again. So I don't know if Dogman is literally leading people's souls to the afterlife, but it's certainly another one of those images that's consistent with the broader phenomenon as well. And perhaps I overemphasized. No, I didn't actually, but there are other psychopomp and shamanic animals that you see across UFO literature that crop up in folklore in different places. Things like bees and deer. A lot of these other animals also have associations with psychopomps and shamanic travels as well. And they do pop up from time to time.
Speak about bees. Yeah, that's kind of interesting.
Well, there are a couple of different ways that you can take this. One of the most common things that's heard prior to an abduction experience, John Mack mentioned this, was a buzzing sound. And oftentimes it's compared to a swarm of bees. Guess what a very common sound at the onset of a near-death experience is? It's a buzzing sound. I've collected buzzing sounds in conjunction with Sasquatch reports. There's a famous case from Cornwall of this young girl named Anne Jeffries who was taken away to fairyland. When she was returned, she said it sounded as if there were 1,000 flies swarming about her head. Bees are an important psychopomp symbol because, as we know today, they can travel vast distances and return to their hive. Again, they're very good at navigation, travel. These are themes that you always see in the psychopomp stuff. Specifically, how bees manifest in some of the ufological literature. There is a relatively obscure book written by a fellow of the name of, and I want to make sure I get his name right, so I'm going to cheat. But I believe that his name was, Gerald Hurd. It was a book from the 1950s called "Is Another World Watching?"
H-U-R-D or H-E-R-D?
H-E-A-R-D.
Okay.
Is Another World Watching? The Riddle of the Flying Saucers, and he talked about using. He thought that maybe you could contact extraterrestrial entities by forming communications with bees, which is a little bit absurd, but it's another connection, and I kind of wonder if that sort of association with bees and death isn't an outgrowth of the sort of buzzing that you get at the onset of these different contact modalities, to borrow a Ray Hernandezism. Or, the buzzing sound also appears at the onset of a lot of psychedelic trips. I think it's one of the things that people hear at the beginning of DMT trips as well sometimes. So there seems to be some consistency with that. And the deer that I mentioned as well. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The reason I asked that, though, is because my backyard is like filled with bees. And like bumblebees as big as my thumb, like everywhere.
Oh, wow.
And they're very peaceful. You can walk right by them. I haven't been stung once. It's very strange. But go on, you're
Yeah.
going with
No,
deer. I'm just
well,
putting that as an aside.
one of my sons is deathly afraid of bees, and I keep telling him like they won't harm you if you don't harm them. But
Wasps are a different matter entirely.
wasps are different, yes. But it's so cool that you have so many bees in your backyard. I mean, it must be a pretty healthy environment for them. So yeah, we see deer. Deer have strong associations with Odin, who was, we normally think of Norse psychopomps as being the Valkyries, but Odin fulfilled that capacity as well in a lot of different contexts, in addition to being all father. Odin sometimes was depicted as a ferryman. Imagine that, right? But there are these famous instances of deer appearing as sort of a companion in the same capacity that we would expect to see Mike's owls, right? You hear stories of abductees who see deer with these gigantic eyes. There's a famous example of, I believe her name was Virginia Horton, that Bud Hopkins talked about, who was an experiencer, a lifelong experiencer, who followed a deer that she felt was very strange and had sort of an uncanny intelligence of its own into a forest, and emerged hours later, and it was apparently another abduction experience. Through Hopkins's lens, this was a screen memory, but if you just look at that narrative of this girl being led into a forest in France by a deer, I mean, that's straight out of the fairy literature, and it's the idea again, the deer is leading you into another realm. It's that idea popping up again. So that's where deer end up coming into the picture.
All right, so what about ravens? You talked about Odin. We might as well go with ravens.
Yeah, well, that's the interesting thing is that there's this. You see the ravens. I found a couple of references here and there in the UFO literature. You don't see them as often, but they are another one of those potent psychopomp symbols. Just generally, birds that would feed on carrion are something that you see time and time again. You've got to this day, there are some cultures that still practice sky burials, where they just leave the body on a mountain open to the elements and allow the scavenging raptors to take away the bits of the body. But corvids appeared at a time depth that's probably unfathomable in indigenous cultures as tricksters, which brings in the George P. Hansen stuff. Hermes was a trickster. Hermes was also a psychopomp, so that's something that's worth considering. But just the idea, any bird that feasts on flesh was long ago given this sort of psychopomp status. And it probably goes all the way back to Göbekli Tepe. There are bas-reliefs of vultures on some of those T-shaped pillars that seem to suggest that it was one of the first things that we sort of identified with death. The Valkyrie's wings that we alluded to, I mentioned Valkyries a moment ago. Those were originally corvid wings before they were turned into swan wings. Yeah. So, and then of course, there are some traditions in France that would say that the fairies' preferred alternate way to appear would be as birds. And of course, things like owls and ravens would be part of that as well. And witches' familiars and all these things, keep coming up. So, yeah. One of my favorite examples of a bird, it's not quite a raven, but it's not exactly a real bird either, was the experience of Betty Andreas and Luca. I don't know if you're familiar with her story as chronicled by Raymond Fowler. One of the visions that she had, that's sort of the famous vision from Fowler's work with the Andreasen Affair and The Watchers, the books that he wrote on her experiences, was a holographic depiction of a phoenix that appeared in one of her experiences. And it's like, oh, that's a death rebirth motif, for real. In fact, Betty's experiences were one of the main things that pushed Fowler to sort of abandon nuts and bolts ufology and to sort of embrace the strangeness that the subject had to offer as well. And so not only that, but all of Betty's experiences were tied up in very sort of near-death experience imagery, like this bright hall of light where she was to go to meet the one through this door that everyone passes through. I mean, it sounds a lot more like a near-death experience than it does anything else, but just so happens to be a near-death experience accompanied by gray aliens. But yeah, holographic phoenix. So the bird imagery is something that runs throughout the UFO story. Not just owls, but all sorts of different birds.
So Hector Ayala has a very specific question. Are cardinals considered psychopomps?
No, but and I am going to use my cheat sheet again here. In other words, my my PDF of Ecology of Souls. I did find a very I'm trying to remember exactly what. Oh, there. Yep. So they're not specifically a psychopomp. I never found a specific reference to cardinals as psychopomps, but there is a Cherokee myth that discusses the sun mourning for her daughter, and the world was just sort of covered in darkness. And the Cherokee people, sought out the wisdom of their little people and said that if they wanted the sun to come again, they had to bring back the sun's daughter from the ghost country, the land to the west that was darkening. And 7 people were chosen. And the little men told them, the little people told them that they had to take a box with them. And when they got to the land of the dead, they would find the ghosts dancing, and they had to stand outside the circle. And when the sun's daughter passed in the dance, they had to strike at her with the rods, and she'd fall to the ground, and they would put her into a box. And under no circumstances should they open it. And this was something that they should definitely not do, because if they didn't open the box, no one would die ever again. It would have actually sort of allowed souls to pass between our world and the afterlife. But as so often goes in these stories, they did open up the box, and what flew out was a little red bird. So not specifically a cardinal, but given the number of cardinals that we have in the southeast of America, and the Cherokee being a southeastern tribe, it might very well be a cardinal in that story.
Okay. Now, in terms of, Ecology of Souls, what other emergent themes kind of jumped out at you as you were writing it that you hadn't really considered going into it?
There's a really weird one. Well, maybe I'll save the really weird one because it's the epilogue, and it's kind of it probably requires too much explanation even in the time that we have left. But it's on this persistent theme of headlessness that we see in these different stories. But one thing that I hadn't had the chance to write about that I jumped upon with great excitement was lake monsters. I've always loved lake monster stories, and I've never been able to find a way to work them into my other book. There was a point after writing Where the Footprints End and people saying, oh, it's Passport to Magonia for Bigfoot. I was like, fine, then I'll do Passport to Magonia for lake monsters. Let's do that. And then I picked up a copy of Michel Mergier's Lake Monster Traditions. I don't know if you're familiar with this book.
No, I'm thinking there's a horror writer who wrote a bunch of short stories.
Oh no, this
had an anthology. It's called North American Lake Monsters, but I'm not remembering his name off the top of my head, though, unfortunately.
This is Lake Monster Traditions by Michel Mergier and another author, and it's one of my favorite books ever written. It's amazing. It's Passport to Magonia for lake monsters. It's out of print. I don't know why there isn't an ambitious new publisher who won't pick it up, and I mean, there must be some sort of rights issue, but anyway. So I took Mergier's book and started looking at this death theme, and I have to say that one of the things that I'm kind of terrified of now is lake monsters. And there's this long-standing conflation of lake monsters and dragons, and then of course dragons and the devil, if we're using that sort of transitive property. Dragons as soul devourers. You'll see these references that I cited a couple of examples of some locals being approached by lake monsters in small boats and saying, they're being sort of a visitor with them, and them saying, no, don't worry about it. They don't harm you physically. They harm your souls. And it's like, oh, geez.
Oh, even better. Better.
But if we sort of apply sort of a quasi-Jungian approach to the lake monster in general, you'll note, we mentioned earlier the circle of the flying saucer being a totality symbol. Jung compared it to the mandala. So it's a circle, it's whole, And you kind of get a little bit of that in some of those "Here There Be Dragons" illustrations on maps, right? You've got the sea monster's tail sort of in these spiraling circles. But when you actually have a sighting of it, you don't get that. You get a half circle, which to me sounds like the cycle is incomplete, right? And there have been a lot of comparisons of lake monsters as they appear in their most common form as humps in the water. Oftentimes they're mistaken for overturned boats, which to me kind of sounds like we've been talking about boat symbolism, right? An overturned boat is kind of like you didn't make the passage to the afterlife. That's the symbolism that I see there, especially when you put it against these chilling illusions about, oh, they harm your souls. And then again, the dragon, the soul devourer, the the serpent that devours the world, in both Revelation and in, Ragnarok and stuff like that. And something that I don't know if it has any sort of basis at all, but I think it's an interesting observation, is that if you look at the sort of animals besides plesiosaurs, right, that a lot of these lake monsters are compared to, you'll get horses, which again, what have we talked about horses being, another one of those sort of psychopomp symbols. But you also get,
like
illusions
seahorses or like aquatic, like.
Oh no! I mean, there's a whole subset of lake monsters that are like water horses, and in some parts of like Western Europe, they're specifically called water horses. And sometimes they'll appear as a real horse on the shore, and you'll hop onto it, and it'll carry you to your doom. Again, carry you to your death. But so you've got the horse thing going on. But if you take a look at the things that are seen in a lot of these sort of lake monster reports, you get allusions to crocodile or alligator heads. You get sort of, believe it or not, you got to take my word on this, there are allusions to a mane on things like Nessie and some water horses sometimes. Which is not a very marine mammal sort of feature to have, but putting that aside, a mane, and then the sort of the appearance in that hump form that I mentioned. You've got sort of something that's kind of almost hippopotamus-like, right? And these three animals were so feared by the Egyptians that at death, if your heart was weighed against a feather and found to be heavier, your soul would be tossed to Ammit, which was a combination. It was a demoness that was a combination of crocodile and hippopotamus and lion. And so it's kind of like, well, you've got these allusions to lake monsters doing horrible things to your soul and that dragon imagery, and it's often described with these components that comprise Ammit. And Aleister Crowley, he used to live on the shores of Loch Ness and Boleskine House. And I've always found that to be a really interesting data point. Like, why is he there? Was Al just really into dinosaurs, or was he tapping into something else that's there? And
did you ever find out?
I don't think there's been. I mean, he always made some allusions to there being some powers there, right? Which, again, doesn't really correspond to a surviving plesiosaur or a long-necked pinniped or any of the other things that the cryptozoologists want to trot out. But one of the entities that Crowley said that he worked with the most was Corazon, who was synonymous.
Oh yeah, that's the thing with the abyss, right?
Who was synonymous with Apep, who was also synonymous in some circumstances with Ammit. So I just see that as, and so I don't know, like the Loch Ness Monster stories go all the way back to like, I think 500 or something. I'm probably getting that wrong. I've got it written down accurately in the book, but like they go back a long time. And so it's not like Crowley did something and brought the Loch Ness Monster there, but like was he sort of following a thread? Because you've got this sort of soul devouring motif and Ammit and Apep and Corazon. Like, is there something there? And it just all feels very, again, sort of consistent to me. So yeah, that's the one thing I just absolutely did not expect, was to leave the project terrified of lake monsters of all things. But that's the real existential threat, right? Like you write a book like Ecology of Souls, and it's like, well, dying doesn't seem so bad. It's the getting there that's the painful part. But then you hear something about like, oh, there are worse things than dying that you see in some of these traditions, like
Say
having
more.
your soul devoured. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, same. Let's dive into that a little bit. Like, what are some of the examples of things that can happen?
Well, you sort of alluded to the cosmic bug zapper.
Yeah.
And that was, as long as we're talking about aliens and death and all those things, we'd be remiss. Again, just the literature review that you have to do for a project like this, because even though no one's talked about it in depth, like a lot of people have had thoughts over the years. And one of those people that you kind of have to talk about is Nigel Kerner, who speculated that the gray aliens were, I believe I'm getting this right, the gray aliens were these soulless automatons devised by a superior
By the way, I
race.
got the name of that. I got the name of that story wrong. It's the City of the Singing Flame.
City of the Singing Flame. That sounds kind of theosophical in and of itself, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's amazing. You should read it afterwards. You
yeah,
can find
I'm
it
going
for free
to
on the internet.
Yeah, I was about to say, being that old, it's probably online. But Nigel Kerner said that the Greys were devised by a superior race, and if memory serves, I don't have it in front of me right now, but if memory serves, they were sort of tasked with collecting souls. And one of the ways that they did this was there were illusions that, if memory serves with Nigel's work, and it's been a little bit since I've revisited that, but there are these illusions that like going into the light was the actual trap. It was kind of the bug zapper that you were alluding to. It was more like a soul vacuum than anything else, and the Greys were just waiting to vacuum up your soul at the point of death. I don't know what I think about that, but I cannot help but see fairy parallels, because there was a rather localized, relatively short-lived tradition that's been very much popularized in urban fantasy books and the like. But there was a tradition in Scotland that every 7 years or so, the fairies in Scotland would owe a teind or tithe to the devil of human souls, and they would go about collecting human souls to deliver to hell every 7 years as part of maintaining their status in the world. So, there are some overlaps there, and both of those sound much worse than just dying. Give me the NDE any day. Although I've talked to a lot of people, since Ecology's come out, and this is something that I didn't address, who are just skeptical of the NDE in general. Like they think that it's a cover for something more sinister along the lines of what I've been talking about, like as a vector to harvest souls. So who knows? And here's the thing. If that is indeed the case, then it makes sense why, certain spiritual practitioners would spend time in meditation to prepare for that moment, to scout ahead and know the ins and outs and all the pitfalls. Something you see in a lot of indigenous cultures is that the road to the afterlife is full of different threats, from demons to chasms to rolling boulders and stuff like that. And, if you don't have a psychopomp to lead you through that process, then you better have some idea of what to expect. So, it's really interesting.
So I got a question about your thoughts on the Elohim.
It's a good question, and it's something that I have not dived into a ton. I always did find it curious that Elohim is plural. And that certainly certainly goes against the monotheistic tenets of Judaism and Christianity. As far as the role that they might play in all this, I don't know. There are some people who use that to point to like some sort of idea of panspermia. I think that there's a lot of compelling evidence for panspermia. I just have never really fully engaged with it. It's not because I'm necessarily opposed to it, but I think the presence of something like Oumuamua shows that it's completely feasible in concept that you could have life going from planet to planet. Sort of seems like a little bit of a moving of the goalposts, but the idea of the Elohim as being sort of a council if I had to sort of tie it into the ecology model, it would be the idea that we're dealing with a plurality of presences, as we've sort of been talking about through all this, that there are different things that are out there that fulfill different niches. But it's a good question, and it's something that it's not that, again, not that I haven't read about it, not that I haven't looked into it. It's just never been something that's really been quite germane to what I'm working on at the time. But a good question.
What about lore around the so-called Watchers?
Oh my goodness. You're gonna drop that on me with 10 minutes to go.
Of course. No, we still have more.
Yeah.
We have 20 minutes. It ends at 10 after the hour.
Oh, that's right. Well,
got time.
I mean,
We got time.
it hasn't factored into this, but and there's something I really want to say that a friend of mine said that I thought was really brilliant regarding the Watchers, but I can't say it because I don't want to steal their idea. So I'm just gonna put that to the side and just engage with the idea of what the Watchers are. Yeah, I think that what's the best way I can say this?
I know you really want to say the other thing, but
I know I really want to say the other thing because it's the only, now that I can't say it, it's the only thing that's coming to my mind about something that, you know, interesting that I can say about the Watchers.
Well, why don't you start with what are the Watchers? Just define that, and after you get through that, you'll probably have
imprisoned angels from Mount Hermon that will be released and are chained up is pretty much the thumbnail sketch that I'm familiar with. You know, there are some people who say that that there's an active Watcher cult that's trying to sort of, in an accelerationist capacity, bring about the end of the world. I don't know how I feel about that.
Red heifer stuff in Israel, like all that.
It's tied into that a bit, but I think the people who sort of put that forward think that it's a little bit more pernicious than that. I think when you sort of look at the Watcher stuff, you've got to also take a look at just giants in general, and it sort of leads us down that Nephilim path. So I'm going to fold the Watchers question into giants, which is this idea that, you know, that's something else that I've never really known what to do with, is these stories of giants that are found in burial mounds and stuff, these giant skeletons. And I've heard some compelling stories about those remains being found, and I've heard some that sound just like, you know, yellow journalism.
Yeah,
but
the two competing narratives. I think the Smithsonian has been calling it a hoax for years. Right. And then the counter narrative is that there are, like, Lovelock Cave is, I think, the cleanest example of where they found like a 7 foot tall or something like that. And there's also allusions to red-headed giants. That's the other weird. Well, six-fingered too is the other common thing they talk about.
It becomes a bit of a minefield because I tend to view all these ancient sacred sites as being built predominantly by the people who were there. And a lot of people will say, oh, these giants built the mounds. And I think that there were anomalous remains that were found in these mounds. A good example of this is a scholar by the name of Barbara Mann, who, at the behest of the tribe that she was associated with, actually wrote a book on the mounds and goes out of her way to say, yeah, there were some strange remains that were anomalously large that cannot be accounted for by the regular separation that you get of skeletons, right? So there's something to it. I tend to view those much the same way that I have viewed things like saints' relics and whatnot. But there's also this connection between fairies and giants and dwarves and giants. There's a lot of conflation in places like Scandinavia of dwarves and giants. And giants sort of being a symbol of a lot of different things, being guardians of the dead. Sometimes giants were featured in the Wild Hunt, which was sometimes a procession of the dead. But also these stories where giants embody that shamanic theme of dismemberment that I mentioned earlier. There are multiple stories about giants or gigantic beings at the beginning of time that were dismembered to form the basis for reality. Ymir the Frost Giant's a good example. Tiamat is another good example in the respective mythologies. So the giant thing is definitely tied up in this, which seems counterintuitive to the discussion of small souls that we had earlier, but it's also a class of beings that falls under that fairy umbrella, and then sort of provides a back door for you to start talking about Bigfoot.
All right. Now, earlier on, you mentioned something about headless people, and
I can't.
We got 15 minutes. I don't know.
Okay.
We might have time.
Okay. So I've noticed this. I'm just going to throw a bunch of data points out there, and you'll see if they start to form a cohesive picture. I've noticed this subset of stories throughout all these different topics involving headlessness, headless UFO occupants, headless men in black.
I've never heard this before, so I'm enraptured by it. I mean, other than Irving Washington, Washington Irving.
Well,
I don't know why I put that backwards.
And the headless horseman was based on the Dullahan, the Irish headless horseman, which is sort of a fairy category as well. A lot of the internments that you find both in the old world and the new world, they were decapitated. There was a Kiefer Mound in Ohio. The skeletons were all decapitated with the head placed between the knees. Some headless Bigfoot stories that are out there. Keel talked about some of those.
Just the remains of, or like walking around?
Like walking around headless Bigfoot, yeah. The T-shaped pillars at Göbekli Tepe, which conspicuously lack heads. Aleister Crowley and the Headless Right. Not the Bornless Right, as some people have it, but originally the Headless Right.
Say more. I'm not familiar with that.
It was originally an exorcism ritual, and it's basically this idea that becoming headless, or in some interpretations bornless, but the original version was headless, that you were sort of attaining the godhood, and by which you could command spirits. The Headless Right in occultism has ascended to a place of putting you in a position of authority to command spirits, because if you can exercise them, you have control over them, so you can command them to appear and do certain stuff. So the Headless Right, then you have these allusions to people who have near-death experiences and suddenly have 360-degree vision, which is a certain sort of headlessness in a way.
I mean, even even owls can. The reason they can't turn their eyes, they can. I don't know if they can do it. Can they do a 360? I can't.
Well, yeah, they can. I think they can.
But their eyes are just very narrowly, like they can't turn their eyes. It's because they're tubes. They're not really eyeballs.
Decapitated owls and ibises in grave goods from Scandinavia to Egypt. What else? Couple of headless fairies that I mentioned. I'm trying to think of some other things. Some people who describe the psychedelic experience as having no head. Again, this idea of headlessness. These Celtic headhunting cults, which were mirrored in some other populations around the world that also placed an emphasis on the head. Just a lot of headlessness in general. And what does that mean? And the entire idea kind of broke for me when I discovered the Christian iconography of cephalophores, which are saints who were beheaded but still lived. It's an entire subset of saint iconography where you have saints holding their heads under their arms and stuff. You've seen this before.
I've seen it, but I'm not aware of it at all. Like
CEPHLAPHORES. Now, here's the thing that really sort of set it off in my mind, because we've been talking about UFOs as souls and about consciousness and about all this stuff. There's a problem in artistic depictions of cephalophores on saints. Where do you put the halo? And some artists left it on the stump of the neck. Some artists just put it on the head of the arm. Some artists did both. But that in turn, with this headless motif, led me down the artistic depictions of halos. And halos we're used to halos being glowing circles, but halos have been depicted in Byzantine art as chevrons. They've been depicted as triangles in some Christian iconography.
Mhm.
You'll find Vesica Piscis and other shapes in Eastern traditions of halo depictions. And you kind of realize, oh, all these halo shapes are UFO shapes, right? And when you take a look at that and you start thinking about these illusions that we made over the course of this discussion about glowing lights being as UFOs, but also perhaps being some aspect of the soul or being human souls, and then headlessness, the idea of headlessness is a metaphor for liberating the consciousness, I think. And you'll find this in a bunch of different spiritual traditions. Obviously, it's kind of encoded in that cephalophore tradition. And so I kind of wonder if that's not what all those headless things that we've been talking about. Because again, if you look at this in terms of a pan-paranormal phenomenon, all this headlessness might be pointing towards that liberation of the consciousness factor.
Anything
Yeah,
related to
that's
orbs too? You were talking about the halo, liberating of
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah,
consciousness.
it's the orb
There's,
thing because orbs as souls are universally seen around the world. So orb as soul, halo, decapitation head, releasing conscious. It's all this seems to me to be a lot of the same thing that we're talking about. So it does sort of underscore that idea that at least the lights do have something to do with death, and it may very well be like it might not even be a metaphor at all. Your soul is a glowing ball of light. I don't know. Again, it's a lot easier. It's a lot stronger case that can be made over the course of 260,000 words than it can over 2 hours. But it's definitely a lot of circumstantial things that led me to that conclusion. And circumstantial things at the end of the day are circumstantial. But when you put that consistency against everything else, it all seemed to click for me. Yeah.
Is there anything when you're doing the research that disturbed you about it?
The lake monster stuff, honestly, was like the most disturbing thing. That and this idea that I don't know. Do you meditate?
I don't think I'm capable of it. I've tried. I
Yeah.
can't.
So yeah, and so
I
there are
really
these
struggle with it.
yeah. So these allusions to the idea of like certain traditions that meditate so that they'll know what the heck they're doing when they die. Yes, Gray Owl. The headline, yeah, that's tied up in there too. Yeah, prior to the assassination of Kennedy, it was all about shots to the heart in media, and after Kennedy, it was all about shots to the head. But yeah, the idea that you have to sort of get a lay of the land before you go there, and the fact that a lot of us aren't doing that, myself included, is a little bit disturbing to me. Because it sounds like I don't have a fighting chance, but yeah. Yeah. So that was probably the other thing now the good news about that is that, I can actually try to be dedicated and do it. But my thing about meditation is that I always get like 10 days in and it's going really well. And then something will happen and I'll skip a day and then it'll sort of snowball from there. And then next thing I know, it's 3 months and I haven't done it. And I don't want to start back at the starting point. But it's like that old adage says, if you have 10 minutes to meditate, meditate for 10 minutes. If you don't have 10 minutes to meditate for 20 minutes, So,
I mean, how do you know it's even working? That's always been my problem with it.
Right. I've just always had a bunch of chatter. And the concept I grok the concept, but the execution always falls short. Now, of course, there's the other way. Terence McKenna was fond of telling this joke about a monk who was practicing a city of levitation and was very excited to tell a great master that he could levitate over the river. And the great master looked at the student and said, "Yeah, but the ferry just costs a nickel." So it's the idea that like there are other ways to get there. There are other cheaper, easier ways to get there than spending all that time and focus and energy. But I'm a little bit too afraid of that as well. So
Yeah, I just had somebody just saying hypnosis has never worked for them. I've never tried it, but I have similar suspicions. If that makes sense.
I have kind of that suspicion. I kind of have that suspicion too. So maybe I just doomed, Sean. I don't know.
Well, I also like that. I also like the concept of advanced reconnaissance, because there's another horror author who explores that. His name's John Langan, and he's got a short story where a dying soul avoids the light and ends up in like these ancient ruins. Where there's just kind of like nothing.
Cyclopean monuments.
Yeah. Like very Lovecraftian in some sense, in his own way. But you don't take that path. Where else do you go? On the other hand, people who explain or have near-death experiences often say that there's kind of a knowing, like they kind of know the moment they pass through that light, that they're like, oh yeah, it's this thing again. And
well, one of the things that I'm fond of saying is that I don't know if you have this experience, but I certainly do. Whenever I fly in a dream, my first thought isn't, oh, I'm flying, wow. It's always, oh yeah, I remember how to do this. Yeah. It's always that's always the feeling that I have whenever I fly.
It's funny you say that. I was actually I was thinking about that today, and it's not something I think about every day. Right. But it's just like when you have a dream, I've definitely had that experience where you're trying to get somewhere, like, oh yeah, I can fly. I just fly there. And I'm just like, if I just kind of flap a little bit, it'll come up, and then I just know how to do it.
So what does that
sometimes, and that's a dream, but sometimes I think maybe that wasn't a dream.
Yeah. So is that astral travel, or is that you remembering that part of yourself that does that? I don't know. But here's the real takeaway that I would have for Ecology of Souls, and it's that multiple times working on this project, my wife was like, nobody wants to read a book on death, Josh. Like, this is depressing. And I said, no, it's actually been a really life affirming journey. And one of the things that has been a constant theme that I found across a lot of these different experiences, near-death experiences, UFO experiences, pharmacological altered states of consciousness, obviously spiritual traditions, it's this idea of dying to death. That might have been what the Eleusinian mysteries were about, but it's certainly what we see with psilocybin use with terminal patients. They die to their fear of death. They die to their fear of death. And by doing that, it allows them to actually focus their energy and their optimism and the time that they have on this earth. And so that's sort of the main takeaway that I always try to give people is, die to death and start living. That's Ecology of Souls.
Okay. Any final words for the audience? You have 2 minutes.
You can find me at...
I'll just ask you another question.
That's fine. You can find me at joshuacutchin.com. That's JOSHUACUTCHIN.com. I do have copies of all of my books, but especially a bunch of copies of Ecology of Souls that you can buy directly from me. Just reach out to me on my website. Unlike buying it on Amazon, I can provide a discount if people buy the set as a bundle. So just write to me for more information about that. Obviously signed to whoever you want it signed to. As far as upcoming appearances go, I will be I'll be in my own backyard this year at Mystic South in Atlanta. That's July 26th through 28th. And that website is mystic-south.com. I will also be at the Paranormal Research Symposium in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania on August 17th, 2024.
While you're there, while you're there, go visit one of my probably distant cousins' monuments, Lieutenant Charles E. Hazlett, Battery D, U.S. Artillery.
I will do that.
It's near Little Round Top, if not on Little Round Top.
Perfect.
He was the guy who commanded the artillery battery that Joshua Chamberlain was protecting.
Unfortunately,
he got shot in the head by a Confederate soldier.
I will definitely do that.
Yeah.
So those two conferences, and then on November 1st through 3rd, I will be at Strange Realities 2024 in Nashville, Tennessee. Links to all those appearances are on joshuacutchin.com. And yeah, it's been a pleasure. It has flown by, and you were able to coax a lot more out of me than I thought you would. So so kudos to you.
I'm good at that. I just keep asking
Yeah.
questions. Stephen, thank you very much. I really appreciate the super chat. And I really appreciate you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and yeah, thank you to everybody in the chat. These have been some really good questions, so I really appreciate it.
All right, my friend. You have a great rest of the remaining weekend. I think you're on East Coast time, so it's pretty late for you. You probably need to get some sleep.
Yeah. I gotta get up and go to the word mines tomorrow morning. That's the life of a writer. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, I do that and many other things. I need to write a little bit more. But thank you, everyone, and y'all have a great Sunday night. And if it's not Sunday, if it's Monday morning, also have a great start to your work week. All right. Talk to soon, everybody. Thank you.